Well, tenancy deposit protection is an evergreen topic here at Property Tribes. It came into effect in 2007, but there's a lot of detail and nuances that we need to keep up to speed on. And joining me today is our TDP partner. It's Mike Morgan, Head of Adjudication at TDS. And Mike, I'm really going to put you through your paces today because I've looked across Property Tribes and had a look at some of the quite random things that crop up in TDP, and it's funny how often they do. And I think one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, what happens if a tenant dies? How is the deposit dealt with?
Well, as you quite rightly say, it does happen quite often in tenancy disputes that we deal with. I think the most important thing to start off with is to say that the tenancy itself won't necessarily end because of the death of a tenant. Mm-hmm. It does depend on the terms of a tenancy agreement, but normally we find that tenancy agreements don't provide this tenancy ends in the event of the death of a tenant. Mm-hmm. So tenancy will continue. The deceased tenants' representatives would need to deal with it on their behalf, their estate representatives. So we'd normally want to see a grant of probate or letters of administration authorising somebody to act on behalf of the tenant, and we would deal with it in exactly the same way as we do in any other dispute. It's just essentially having that authority to deal with somebody other than the tenant that we need to have in place.
Now, it's interesting that the prescribed information can actually help in this process, because one of the things that is needed on the prescribed information is a forwarding address for the tenant at the end of the tenancy. And very often on Property Tribes, I do say capture the next of kin details for a tenant, and the prescribed information actually does that, doesn't it?
It does. One thing it particularly asks for, which is often forgotten, is an address, as you say, where the tenant can be reached at the end of the tenancy. Not the address where they're going to be living, they might not know, the address where they can be reached. So that could be post, could be email, could be a relative, as you say, could be next of kin. So it's really the best address, the best person to speak to at the end of the tenancy to negotiate the return of that deposit. So it's a good piece of information to get straight right from the outset.
It is. Also, gardens do crop up from time to time as well. I think there is some confusion about who's responsible for the garden and so on. Do you find you get the garden coming into disputes?
Yes, we get a good number of cases every year that are about disputes to do with gardening. One of the sort of red herrings that comes up quite a lot is a belief that a landlord has to provide gardening equipment for a tenant to be responsible for the garden. And that's not the case. A landlord doesn't have to provide cleaning materials for a tenant to be responsible for cleaning the property. So the same principles apply to gardening. Unless that tenancy agreement makes the provision of gardening equipment part of the deal, the tenant is still responsible. We do see some big variations in how the clauses in the tenancy agreements are worded, though. So I think there's something that can be done here about setting out more clearly what those gardening obligations are. You know, it's better, rather than saying property should be garden should be returned in a seasonally homogeneous condition, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, actually spell it out. What do you expect the tenant to be responsible for? So we'd normally expect things like cutting the lawn, weeding, tidying the borders and so on. It wouldn't normally be full-grown landscape gardening. Wouldn't expect them to be tree surgeons. So let's try and manage those expectations for tenants, and that will help.
Now, I think it's well worth reminding everybody, just as we close out here, that there's so many resources on the TDS website. There's templates, there's checkout lists. We would advise everybody to take advantage of those.
Absolutely, and one of the documents we've launched just recently, which is going down a storm, is a deposit deduction template. So it's a document that helps you negotiate with your tenant at the end of the tenancy, sets out in a nice logical way what you want, why you want it. And we're getting good feedback from members now that where they use that, tenants understand better why they're responsible for certain payments at the end of the tenancy, and they're reaching agreement a little more easily. So definitely go to the website and give those things a try.
Excellent. Well, we'll pop the address underneath this video, and if you've got any questions about tenancy deposit protection, do drop them in the TDP category here on Property Tribes, because Mike in person is here to support the community and answer any questions you may have. So thanks very much, as always, Mike, for your contributions to Property Tribes.
Thank you, Vanessa.